Welcome back to the Harris Library, and here we go into the study of feminism. Last time we looked briefly at the woman question and its manifestations in the 18th century, and really that's a lot of what's the kind of foundation of the suffrage movement and the other parts of feminism that are to come. Now, one of the things we're going to talk about is that feminism means different things in different time periods. To different people, it means different things, and we're going to talk a lot about that today. Now, feminism is a complicated sort of thing, and I've given you the next two illustrations as handouts. This is the wave illustration, and one of the things that you'll hear when you hear discussions of feminism is this question of the different sections of it. And so often the illustration that's given is the waves, that the first wave is suffrage in the 19th century until the vote comes in, at least in Britain and the United States in 1920 in the United States and 1918 and 1928 in Britain. And then the second wave is 1960s and ERA. And it's also another wave of suffrage because you've got some places like Switzerland and Sweden, which don't give women the right to vote until 1970. And then the third wave in the 1990s is all about this concept of the gender and of how we talk about women. And it's going to have a lot more about awareness of that it's not just about sex, it's about gender. And then the fourth wave is this kind of social media call out culture and has some other pieces to it. And you see this wave issue that talks about how we're constructing gender in the 1990s, ERA, and radical feminism of the 1960s. And it's an interesting model, but it sort of leaves a lot of stuff out. And there's a number of scholars in recent years who are very dissatisfied with this particular one. I've been at a couple of different conferences where there's been several papers that have attacked this model as inadequate. It leaves out anything that happens between, say, 1920 and 1960 as if there's nothing happening in the questions of women's rights. It leaves out, for instance, one of the hallmark activists for civil rights in lots of different ways, and that's Eleanor Roosevelt. And to leave out Eleanor Roosevelt is seemingly kind of wrong. But it also leaves out some inconvenient pieces of feminism history. And people like Margaret Sanger, who is going to be an advocate for birth control, but she's also a believer in eugenics, okay, and the science of racism. But she falls in the 1920s and the 1930s, the early portion of the 20th century, and she's inconvenient. She doesn't fit the narrative. And so the wave model kind of leaves her out, but isn't really true to what happens in the course of the movement. Now, the second illustration that I've given you is that feminism is a complex thing that morphs and changes over time. And it's easy to understand feminism in that first wave of suffrage. And that's probably where the wave is the most useful kind of illustration, is to see feminism at its kind of beginnings. But even in its beginnings, there are seeds of its conflicts with other ideologies that are going to be prominent in the 20th century and certainly in the 21st. You've got the same chart on your handout. So I want to talk about this for a minute because this is really kind of critical. First wave feminism is about suffrage. Now, there are two different kinds of activists, and we'll talk about them in a minute. Difference between a suffrage and suffragette. And most women in this initial push see the vote as the key piece, but there are also already other issues about daycare for workers and issues about property rights. Others are also bound up in this. And the property rights, some of that's going to largely come before you get to, in fact, the vote. A lot of the opposition to the vote had to do with the idea that giving women, particularly married women, the right to vote was going to simply duplicate their husband's vote. And so what was that going to give you in terms of voting? There are lots of other reform movements at this period. There's going to be economic reform movements. There's going to be socialism. There's going to be political reform movements of lots of different types. And some of those activists, including people who are advocating for the abolition of slavery, are all going to be mixed together. But once some of those other reform movements get their goals,
They split off from the feminists or the suffragists because they aren't after the same thing. Same kinds of things happen once the vote is achieved. You still see others.
and particularly once women do get the vote, you start to see some real splits. And you'll see this, and you've got 4 different groups that I've given you: the liberal feminists, the social feminists, the radical feminists, and the post-structural feminists. Now, one of the key kind of arguments that comes in almost very quickly in is the argument between feminists who are going to be saying that the oppression of women is the problem, and those who are going to argue that no, economics is the problem, okay? And it's all about we need social equality, and male female is not really the issue. It's kind of tangential to the issue, which is this social inequality and economic inequality. And so you get these socialists who are very working class focused, they're very anti capitalist, and they're really not interested in your gender agenda. One of the things that was really fascinating about the election of 2016 is that you saw competing wings of the Democratic base going after the nomination. You see Bernie Sanders, who's a lifelong socialist and is very clear about. And then you've got over on this other side, you've got Hillary Clinton, who represents more the traditional radical feminist, who she's got some other things that she's going to talk about because she wants to try and get elected, but she's very much representative of these radical feminists of the 1960s who argue a lot with the socialists about what needs to be done. And you saw that in the debates between Clinton and Sanders. And it was a really fascinating sort of thing. But it's the most clear, I think, in 2016, because it felt like I was watching the arguments of the 19th century come to life in front of me, because these are the same arguments that were had amongst activists of that period. Now, so you've got the socialists, and then you've got the radical feminists who are going to argue that gender is just a myth. It's just the gender is a construct. They're even going to go further than the Cartesian dualists who are going to say that the mind has no sex, and to say that there is no such thing as this. It's all socially constructed, and we've made this tyranny of biology, and that we need to break that down through technology, and we need to get completely rid of the family. And they attack all structures of government and economics as patriarchy, as patriarchal and giving power to men, and that's the basic problem. Now, we've talked about the radical feminists and the social feminists, but there's another one who are going to be the liberal feminists. And the liberal feminists are all about equity. They're not about women are superior to men and that there's no such thing as sex other than by biology. They're more on the line of the Neoplatonists and the complementarians of the Enlightenment period, and they want equality. Don't get me wrong, they want complete political equality, economic equality, but they also see very different. There are differences in men and women. A lot more European feminists fall into this realm. There are some who are going to be in the gender construct realm, but not all of them are going to agree with that. They're going to be often more towards the liberal end of things, the liberal feminist end of things. And you've also got Camille Paglia, who's over in this realm, who's going to argue with a lot of the radical feminists now and those who want to um, use gender as a construct. And she's also going to argue with a lot of the fourth wave feminism and call out culture. She's a Dionysian. She is a classical liberal, that she doesn't want government involved in most things. She doesn't think there should be any kind of laws really regulating sexual activity except for certain things. But she also is one who believes very firmly that there are in good and evil. And that there are people who do evil things, and evil is not just a product of bad circumstances, that there are people who set out to do harm. And she talks about the differences between predators and prey in a lot of her works. So she's kind of on a different different span of things. And then you got these folks over on this other side. But over here, you've got the post-structural feminists who say there's no one definition of what it means to be a woman. And they're going to reject the radical feminists who they don't like, no, there's actually other things here. They don't necessarily agree with the socialists or the liberal feminists. And actually, they think the idea of what the West says is women or is equality isn't necessarily true for every place. There's a lot of post-colonial activists in this group who say, you know, what women's lives look like in other places that other than the West is a very different thing, and some of your arguments just don't work anywhere but in your little bubble. And you sometimes will see some African American feminists head more towards the post-structural feminists or towards the liberal feminists more than the radical feminists. So you see a lot of discussion here. Now, why do I go through this very, very long-winded talk about these very different groups? It's because sometimes when we use the word feminist, we use it to mean all of the above all at once, and we're not really specific about what we're talking about. And these are vastly different groups who often don't get along at all. They don't like each other. Sometimes they like each other less than they do people who are actively working against them in other ways. And so this is one of those key pieces when we look at feminism. Now we're going to look a little bit at the first forms of feminism and some of the arguments that happen early on. Now we're going to walk through a couple of things about the various waves of feminism. The first forms of feminism, this is a term that's not coined until the 1890s, so the end of the 19th century. It's coined in a French journal that's writing about social reform and women's rights. The first major theorist who could be said to be a feminist besides Wollstonecraft is really Charles Fourier, who is going to be talking about some of this. He's actually going to write some things for various journals. He thinks that the extension of privileges to women is essential to progress. It's very much kind of a Whig argument. It's a very much the liberal, classical liberal argument for women's rights. Some people are not even certain with the wave thing that there's 4 waves. Some say there's only 3. And the 4th wave is all about social media, and it's just about how you're transmitting your message. It's not that there's a different message than the 3rd wave. There's always, as I just showed you, different interpretations of what this word means and what you're trying to accomplish through it. There are differences in goals and allies and who you're working with, who you're willing to work with, and what kind of methodology you'll use. And there are a lot of scholars who are not careful, who really don't like the waves at all for the reasons I described. Now, some of those who are in that group that are more liberal feminists are sometimes what we call relational feminists. Relational feminists are going to use this Neoplatonic view of women, much like what we talked about a few minutes ago, that men and women are complementary. There are you need them both. They both need to have a voice in society. This is the idea that supports women be involved in a lot of social reform movements, even before they get the vote, because they're more in tune with certain aspects of society than men are. And you need both voices. You'll see this in the writings of women like Josephine Butler, who's a noted kind of female theorist. I hate to call her feminist because it's hard to put her in a particular camp. She's probably closer to the liberal feminist than anybody else.
Butler's really important, and we're going to stop and look at a little bit more about her life.
So could you tell us a bit more about Josephine Butler? Who was she? What was her background?
Josephine Butler was born into a relatively wealthy family, and she married a clergyman. And through that marriage and through her own personal bereavement, the loss of her youngest child, she threw herself into a really extraordinary social campaign. And the reason why I think I want to emphasise Butler's importance is because the work she did, on the one hand, sits really in parallel or doesn't seem that related to the question of women's suffrage. But I think the question of women's involvement in politics more generally and what right women have to be represented across a whole society. So Butler's major campaign for what she's remembered, not as strongly as she should be remembered really, is the campaign to repeal the Contagious Diseases Act.
What exactly was the Contagious Diseases Act and why was Butler objecting to it?
The Contagious Diseases Act was a series of legislative interventions aimed at controlling the spread of venereal disease, of sexually transmitted diseases, basically in the army and the military. So it reminds us of several things. One is that this is in the 1860s when this legislation comes in. It's really at the heart, the engine moment of the growth of the British Empire. And among the government administration, there's real concern that the military forces are being debilitated by the spread of sexually transmitted diseases. So what do we do about this? We need our strong army to suppress the empire. How can we control what sailors and soldiers get up to when they are on leave? And the first response to this was to look at the bodies of women in port and garrison towns. So Portsmouth, Colchester, the key cities where soldiers and sailors would have their leave. And it basically was a series of controls imposed on working class women's bodies in those towns. The Contagious Diseases Act gave a huge amount of leeway to government officers, to health officers, to stop women on suspicion of being a prostitute, to subject them to a forcible examination by speculum, which Butler termed a kind of instrumental rape, and to keep them, there's no real treatment for venereal disease in this period, to keep them in what were called lock hospitals, under lock and key, depriving them of freedom, basic freedoms, until they were perceived to be clear of signs of venereal disease. So Butler's choice of a campaign to involve herself in is really radical, because she was taking up the cause of women who were perceived to be completely out of the realms of society, let alone polite society in the time. Women prostitutes, women suspected of being involved in the sex trade, sex work, were treated as the scum of society in this period. They were fallen women. Argued strongly that women, working class women, whether prostitutes or not, had rights to their own body, that to keep them interned in hospitals without trial was beyond the pale. That this sense that you could be subjected to this examination and this lock-up on suspicion of being a prostitute, just for being in the wrong place at the wrong time or dressed in the wrong way, was an absolute, she felt, was an absolute contravention of basic liberal rights of the human being and the human body. So really, her campaigns were very active during the 1870s against this set of legislation. And it was unheard of, really, for a respectable middle-class woman, the wife of an Anglican clergyman and a very high-achieving Anglican clergyman, to stand up in a platform in public and talk about sex and prostitution, and to say, why is it women's bodies that are subject to control? Why is there no attempt to control the men who are themselves the ones seeking out this sexual contact in, when they're on leave, on shore leave? And she was absolutely vilified for it. She had excrement thrown at her. There were huge pamphlet wars against what she was doing. But she felt desperately impelled by her Christian beliefs to say that these women were full humans and should have full human rights. They were not just vessels or bodies, they were people, they were political subjects. And that's a campaign she kept going through her life. In fact, in the latter part of her life, even when she'd achieved the repeal of these acts in Britain by the mid-1860s, these similar sorts of legislation was starting to be enforced in the empire, in India in particular. And so campaigners took up her work over there.
I'm not going to stop and talk about each and every one of these activists in their entirety, but I wanted to spend a little bit of extra time on Butler, because Butler represents so very well all of these activists of the 19th century who are working on a variety of campaigns. Some of it's anti-vivisection, which we would see as anti-animal testing. Some of it is about the Contagious Diseases Act. Some of it's about suffrage. Some of it's about the Women's Property Act. And many of them came together on issues, but sometimes they all had their separate campaigns. And many of them are very much in this liberal kind of feminism, almost individual feminism, this belief in the rights of each woman to be a full participant in society. And like Butler, many of them were driven by their faith. And that's an important key piece in all of this that you shouldn't lose. Now, not all of them came from a point of faith, but Butler certainly does. And several of the others do as well.
You also get individual feminism, even in the 19th century, by women like Emily Davies, who knows and works with occasionally with Josephine Butler. She's going to found Girton College with Barbara Bodkin, Cambridge. And this is going to be a women's college for women. Now, individual feminism tends to argue that women have a separate, not only are different from men, but also that they need to have a different experience, and they sometimes have a different experience away from men, and so they need individual development. We see John Stuart Mill, who's going to advocate in 1867 for giving women the right to vote. They're pushing through universal male suffrage in 1867, and he tries to put an addendum onto the bill and get women the right to vote in 1867 unsuccessfully. He's going to agitate very much for this, and he's going to see this. This is more the liberal wing, the liberal idea of individual rights for individual women. And he's going to write, along with his wife Harriet, he's going to write on the subjection of women, very much advocating for women to get full civil rights. He's also going to argue against what he called white slavery or wage slavery, which involved prostitution. Thanks for watching. Catch more on my YouTube video channel. And next time we'll be looking at more pieces of the development of the waves of feminism than we did today.